The gun was already pressed against Charles Rourke's temple when Matilda Wells walked through the door of the Silver Spur Saloon, and for one terrible, suspended moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. She had not expected this. She had ridden 11 miles through a dust storm, her hands bleeding where the reins had cut into them, her heart hammering with the kind of dread that sits low in a person's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had come because someone had slipped a note under the door of the schoolhouse that read simply, "They are going to kill him tonight. Come before the clock strikes 9." And she had come because whatever dangerous thing was growing between her and Charles Rourke, she could not let it end with a bullet. The man holding the gun was Harlan Goss, and everyone in Caldwell, Kansas knew what Harlan Goss was capable of. He was not a man given to empty threats. His dark past stretched from here all the way back to Missouri, where 3 men had been buried on his account, and not one of his crimes had ever found its way to a courtroom. Charles was on his knees in the sawdust. His shirt was torn at the collar. There was a cut above his left eye, and the blood had traced a thin line down his jaw like a brushstroke. But his eyes, those steady, gray-green eyes, were not afraid. They were watching Harlan Goss with the cold patience of a man who had already made his peace with whatever came next. And then those eyes found Matilda across the room. Something happened in them when they did. Something cracked open. She had no weapon. She had no plan. She had only herself, standing in the doorway of the most dangerous room in Caldwell with sawdust under her boots and her hair coming down from its pins. And for one breathless second, she was the only thing standing between Charles Rourke and whatever dark fate Harlan Goss had decided for him tonight. She would not discover until much later, sitting beside a fire with his hand wrapped around hers, that this was the moment Charles Rourke fell completely and irreversibly in love with her. She would not know it then, standing in the doorway with her heart trying to climb out of her throat. She would not know it when he later said to her, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "You have the quietest way of making a place feel whole." She would have no answer for that. She never would. But the story of how they arrived at that moment, and everything that followed, began much earlier than the night of the Silver Spur. It began on a Tuesday in April of 1882, when the southbound train from Wichita deposited Matilda Wells onto the platform at Caldwell with 2 trunks, a carpetbag, and a contract to teach the children of Comanche County for 1 full calendar year. She was 26 years old. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men in the street, though there was something about her that made people look twice and then look away, as though they had accidentally glimpsed something too sincere for daylight. She was medium height, with dark hair she kept braided and pinned, and brown eyes that paid attention. She paid attention to everything, which was either her greatest gift or her heaviest burden, depending on the day. The town of Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was sitting on a knife's edge. The cattle drives had slowed. The railroad money had come and gone. There was a group of men who had decided the law was a slower and more inconvenient path to wealth than their own methods, and Harlan Goss was at the center of that group like a dark sun around which all the uglier moons revolved. The territorial marshal, a man named Dade, had been shot in January and had not fully recovered. His deputy was a good-hearted young man named Percy Fitch, who was better at organizing church picnics than at facing down outlaws. Caldwell was, in the plainest terms, a town that had lost its backbone and had not yet found a new one. Charles Rourke had arrived 3 months before Matilda, in January, on a horse that looked like it had seen worse days than its rider, which was saying something, because Charles Rourke in January looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together by someone working from memory. He was 31 years old, 6 feet and an inch above it, with the kind of lean, angular build that spoke of years of hard labor and not enough meals. His hair was dark brown and in need of cutting. His jaw was stubbled most days. He had a scar on his right hand that ran from the base of his thumb to his wrist, and he did not explain it, and no one in Caldwell was brave enough to ask. He had taken the job of managing the dry goods store for old Emmett Crane, who was going blind and could no longer read the ledgers. Charles was precise with numbers and honest with inventory, and he did not speak much, which in a town where gossip was the primary entertainment made him either deeply suspicious or deeply interesting, depending on who you asked. The women of the sewing circle leaned toward interesting. The men who gathered at the Silver Spur most evenings leaned toward suspicious. What no one in Caldwell knew, because Charles had not told a living soul, was that he had come to town with a hidden purpose. He had a dark past that he was trying either to escape or to make right, and sometimes those two things were so tangled together that even he could not separate them. He had ridden with a man named Cole Goss 3 years ago, in a period of his life when the line between survival and crime had been a thinner stripe than it should have been. Cole Goss was Harlan Goss's brother. Cole was dead now, shot during a bank robbery in Dodge City in 1879, and Charles had been standing near enough to feel the wind of the bullet that killed him. He had not fired the shot, but he had been there, and being there was its own kind of guilt. He had come to Caldwell because Harlan Goss was here, and because Harlan Goss had in his possession the deed to a piece of land in Colorado that belonged to a woman named Ada Rourke, who was Charles's mother, and who was 63 years old and living on a borrowed patch of Kansas earth, while the home she had built with her own hands was being held hostage by a man who had acquired it through fraud. Charles had not come to Caldwell to be a hero. He had come because the law had proven itself slow and disinterested, and because a son who had once made a very serious mistake owed his mother something, even if the debt was paid in risk. He had also not come to Caldwell expecting to meet anyone who would make him want to stay past the settling of accounts. Matilda Wells arrived on a Tuesday in April, and by Wednesday morning she had already rearranged the schoolhouse in a way that the previous teacher, Mrs. Hennessy, had never thought to do. She moved the desks so the light came in from the left and did not fall directly into the children's eyes. She swept the floor twice, because she felt the first sweep had not been thorough. She pinned a map of the United States on the wall and a handwritten sign that read, "Ask the question you are afraid to ask. That is always the most important one." Charles saw her for the first time on Wednesday afternoon when he was delivering a box of chalk and slates that Emmett Crane had been holding for the school since February. He knocked on the open door of the schoolhouse and she turned, and he had a moment of absolutely no words whatsoever, which was not entirely unusual for him, but felt different this time because it was not indifference that silenced him. "From Crane's," he said, holding up the box, which was an unimpressive thing to say, but it was accurate. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, and took the box from him with both hands, and the relief on her face was so genuine and unguarded that he almost smiled. "You're the new school teacher," he said. "Matilda Wells," she said, and extended her hand, which surprised him because women in Caldwell did not generally offer their hands to strange men in the direct, businesslike manner she offered hers. He shook it. "Charles Rourke." She looked at him with those brown eyes that paid attention, and he had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being seen more clearly than he was accustomed to. "You work at Crane's Dry Goods," she said. "I do. I'll be coming in regularly for school supplies. Paper is what I need most desperately, and good ink if Mr. Crane stocks it." "He does," Charles said. "I'll set some aside." She thanked him with a directness that was neither flirtatious nor dismissive, just honest and warm, and he walked back to the dry goods store with the box gone from his hands and something new in its place that he could not immediately name. The first few weeks of April passed in the rhythm of a town, waking slowly from a winter that had been harder than most. Matilda established herself in the schoolhouse with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what she was doing. She had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, including the Donahue twins who were exactly as difficult as their reputation suggested, and a quiet girl named Rosie Crane, who was Emmett's granddaughter and who had not spoken a word in class since the death of her mother the previous fall. Matilda did not force Rosie to speak. She placed books on Rosie's desk and waited. She asked questions and let the silence sit without filling it with anxiety. She understood, in the particular way that people who have experienced their own grief understand, that silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is the shape of something that has not yet found its words. Charles watched this from a careful distance, because the schoolhouse was on the same side of the main street as Crane's dry goods, and because Matilda came in for supplies every few days, and because he had begun to find reasons to have things ready for her that she had not yet thought to ask for. He ordered a second-grade primer from a publisher in St. Louis, because she had mentioned, entirely in passing, that the ones she had were worn through. He stocked a better quality of ink because the cheap kind left blots. He did these things quietly and did not draw attention to them, which was very much in keeping with his character, and Matilda noticed anyway, because she was a person who paid attention. "You ordered the McGuffey primer," she said one afternoon in mid-April, holding the slim blue volume with an expression that was dangerously close to wonder. "I didn't ask for this." "Emmett thought it might be useful," Charles said, which was not strictly true but was not entirely a lie either, since Emmett had agreed readily when asked. She looked at him over the top of the primer. "Did he? He takes the school's welfare seriously." "Mr. Rourke," she said, and her voice had a warmth in it that landed somewhere in the middle of his chest and stayed there. "Thank you." He said nothing. He wrote the primer in the school's account at a cost he had already subtracted from his own wages, and she did not discover this until later, and by then it was just one more thing to add to the ledger she was quietly keeping about Charles Rourke. The trouble began in earnest in early May. Harlan Goss had taken notice of Matilda, not romantically, but strategically, which was in many ways worse. He had discovered that she was sending letters to the Territorial Land Office in Topeka on behalf of several Caldwell families who were dealing with disputed property claims. She was a woman who could read legal documents and explain them plainly, and this made her a threat to the particular brand of business that Harlan Goss operated, which depended very much on people not understanding what they had signed or what had been taken from them. He came to the schoolhouse one morning before classes began, and Matilda was alone inside arranging papers on her desk. Charles happened to be outside sweeping the boardwalk in front of Crane's, which was not strictly necessary but which he had been doing more regularly since it gave him a clear sight line to the schoolhouse door. Harlan Goss was a large man, not in height but in presence. He was perhaps 45, with a thick gray mustache and small, clever eyes that had the flat quality of a man who had stopped feeling the normal range of human inconveniences years ago. He dressed well. He always dressed well. It was one of his methods. Charles watched him go into the schoolhouse and felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise in a primal way that his body had learned to trust. He set the broom against the wall and crossed the street at a pace that was not quite casual. He came through the schoolhouse door to find Harlan Goss standing across Matilda's desk, speaking in the low, pleasant tone he used when he was making something very clear without technically making threats. Matilda was standing, not sitting, which Charles noted with a particular appreciation. She was standing behind her desk with both hands flat on its surface and her chin level, and she was looking at Harlan Goss with an expression of such composed and deliberate steadiness that the man seemed mildly thrown by it. "Miss Wells," Charles said from the doorway. She looked at him and he saw the relief flicker across her face and disappear just as quickly, replaced by that steady composure again. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Mr. Goss was just leaving." Harlan Goss turned. He saw Charles, and the recognition that moved across his face was slow and careful, like a man reading something in a foreign language. He had seen Charles around Caldwell for months. He had not yet placed him. "Rourke," he said. It was not quite a greeting. "Goss," Charles said. It was not quite one either. Something passed between them in the silence that followed, something that Matilda could feel but not yet fully read. Then Harlan Goss smiled, wide and warm, in the way that made people trust him when they should not have, and walked out of the schoolhouse with his hat tipped to Matilda as though he had simply been paying a social call. Charles watched him go and then turned back to Matilda. She was letting out a breath she had been holding. Her hands, still flat on the desk, were trembling very slightly. He noticed and said nothing because he knew she would not want him to notice. "What did he say to you?" Charles asked. "He said the letters I was helping the Hennessy family write to the land office were causing confusion," she said. "He was very polite about it." "Harlan Goss is always very polite," Charles said. "That is when he is the most dangerous." She looked at him sharply. "You know him." "I know of him." "That is not quite the same thing," she said, and there it was again, those eyes paying their precise and unwavering attention. He could not tell her the full truth. Not yet. The full truth was a dark and complicated territory that he had not yet mapped out for himself, let alone for someone else, but he could tell her enough. "He is not a man who accepts interference gracefully," Charles said. "You should be careful." "I should be careful," she repeated, not with anger exactly, but with the particular tone of a woman who had been told to be careful in circumstances where the more logical response would be to address the source of danger directly. "And the Hennessy family, should they simply accept having their land taken?" "No," he said, "but there are safer ways to help them." "Tell me one," she said. And he could not immediately, which she knew, and which she let sit between them with more patience than he deserved. They did not resolve the argument that day. But something shifted between them, a recognition of something shared, some similar conviction about the way the world ought to work that neither of them had expected to find in the other. May moved forward with the particular stubbornness of a Kansas spring, hot days and cold nights, and the grass on the plain going from brown to the most vivid, almost violent green. Matilda's school was settling into itself. Rosie Crane had spoken. Not much, and not loudly, but she had answered a question about the Missouri River that Matilda had directed to the room in general rather than to anyone in particular, and the other children had gone on with their day as though nothing remarkable had happened, which was exactly the right response. Matilda had kept her face perfectly calm and noted it in her own private ledger as a victory that needed no celebration to be real. She and Charles had fallen into a habit without either of them quite deciding to. He walked her back to her boarding house at Mrs. Alvarez's at the end of the school day, or she stopped at Crane's on her way home, and they talked between the shelves while she gathered what she needed. They talked about books, which they had both read far more of than anyone in Caldwell expected. They talked about the children. They talked about the particular quality of the Kansas light in the late afternoon, how it turned the dust to gold and made the flat land look like it was trying to be beautiful, and mostly succeeding. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not reach for her hand or find excuses to stand close to her, though there were moments when the distance between them felt almost artificial, like something being deliberately maintained. He was careful with her in the way that people are careful with things they know are valuable and know they could damage. She found this both touching and slightly maddening. She had her own secrets that she had not yet shared. She had grown up in St. Louis, the second of 4 children of a schoolteacher father, and a mother who had died of fever when Matilda was 12. Her father had been a good man and a gentle one, and he had taught her that learning was the only inheritance worth handing down, which was why she was here, in a town at the edge of the frontier, teaching children whose parents had come west looking for something better and were still in the process of finding it. She had been engaged once to a man in St. Louis named Walter Kress, who was a lawyer and who had been kind and appropriate in every external measure, and whom she had ultimately understood she could not marry because kindness and appropriateness, while not nothing, were not enough. She had given back the ring and moved west, first to Wichita and then to Caldwell, following the work and following some quieter internal compass that kept pointing her away from the safe and comfortable path. She had not told Charles any of this, not yet, but she thought about it when she was with him, the way she thought about a door that has not yet been opened, curious about what was on the other side. It was the third week of May when Harlan Goss made his next move. He was cleverer than crude intimidation. What he did was this. He went to the school board, which was technically composed of 3 men, all of whom owed him money or favors, and he raised the question of whether a schoolteacher who was involving herself in legal matters outside the classroom was conducting herself appropriately for her position. He did not demand she be dismissed. He simply planted the question like a seed in rocky soil and waited to see what grew. Charles heard about it from Percy Fitch, the deputy, who heard everything and understood some of it and was a genuinely decent man who wanted to help, but lacked the particular kind of fearlessness that the situation required. Percy came into Crane's on a Thursday morning and told Charles what Goss had done, and Charles stood behind the counter with his jaw set and his hands very still on the surface of the wood, and felt the cold, particular anger of a man who recognizes a trap being set for someone who does not fully know they are being hunted. He told Matilda that evening. They were walking back along the main street in the gold-turning light, and he told her plainly and directly what Goss had done and what it could mean for her contract. She listened without interrupting. He had noticed that she always listened this way, without filling the space between his sentences with her own words, and he found it remarkable because almost no one did this. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He is trying to silence me without using a threat he could be held accountable for," she said. "Yes. That is actually a more interesting problem than a direct threat," she said, which was so uniquely Matilda, so precisely her way of tilting a thing into the light and finding its angles, that he turned to look at her and felt something in his chest loosen in a way that was both welcome and frightening. "You are not worried," he said. "I am quite worried," she said. "But I find it helps to be interested in a problem at the same time." He almost said it then. He almost said any of the several things that had been building in him since April, since the blue primer, since the afternoon she had described the way the light fell through the schoolhouse windows in a way that made him feel he was hearing music. But he did not say it, because the timing was wrong and the situation was dangerous, and he had not yet told her the full truth about why he was in Caldwell, which he knew he needed to do before he could say anything else. Instead he said, "I am going to help you." She stopped walking and turned to face him. The evening light was behind her and her expression was something he could not entirely read, which was unusual because he had gotten better at reading her in the weeks they had been spending together. "Why?" she said, not unkindly, just directly, which was her way. He owed her the real answer. "Because Harlan Goss took something from my family," he said, "and because I came here to get it back, and because whatever is happening between us has made the stakes considerably higher than I originally planned for." The silence that followed was different from the usual comfortable kind. It was the silence of someone receiving information and reorganizing everything they thought they knew in the light of it. "Tell me all of it," she said. They sat on the steps of the empty feed store at the end of the street and he told her. He told her about Cole Goss and the robbery, and the 3 years he had spent in Colorado trying to make an honest life after a deeply dishonest episode. He told her about his mother and the land deed and the fraud. He told her about coming to Caldwell with nothing but a plan and a guilt he was trying to discharge through action because he had not found a better method. She listened. She did not flinch from any of it. When he finished, she sat for a moment with the dust settling around their boots and the first stars appearing over the Kansas plain, and then she said, "You were 28 years old and desperate, and you made a serious mistake that you have been trying to account for ever since." "That is a generous reading," he said. "It is an accurate one," she said. "I have read enough legal documents to know the difference." He looked at her. "You are not afraid of me?" "No," she said simply. "Should I be?" "No," he said. And he meant it. She took a breath and said, "Then let us figure out how to solve both problems at once." This was the beginning of the partnership, though it grew into something considerably more than that, and neither of them could have told you exactly when one became the other, because the transformation was gradual and total, like the light changing between afternoon and evening, present everywhere and difficult to locate at any one point. They worked carefully. Matilda continued her correspondence with the land office, but Charles helped her route it through the territorial marshal's office in Wichita rather than directly through Caldwell channels, which meant Goss had no local interception point. They gathered statements from the Hennessy family and two other families whose property claims had been contested under Goss's influence. They wrote a formal complaint and sent it with documentation to a federal land agent named Prescott in Topeka, and they waited. Meanwhile, Charles began building a separate file on the deed to his mother's Colorado property. He had documents from Ada Rourke describing the original purchase, a letter from the county clerk in Colorado who had been pressured to alter the records, and a sworn statement from a man named Tully who had witnessed Harlan Goss pay a sum of money to that same clerk in exchange for changing the title. Tully was currently living in Dodge City, having fled Caldwell 2 years ago after making the mistake of being in the wrong place when Goss was conducting his business. He had agreed to provide the statement by mail, though he had also made very clear he would not be returning to Caldwell to testify in person, which Charles understood completely. June arrived with its full weight of heat, and the school year began its approach toward the summer break that would run through July and August. Matilda's students were making progress that she measured in ways that had nothing to do with recitation and everything to do with whether they asked questions, whether they tried things they were afraid to fail at, whether they were treating each other with the particular decency that she considered the most important thing she could teach. Rosie Crane was reading 3 grade levels above her age. She had not become loud or demonstrative. She was still the quiet girl she had always been, but the quiet was now inhabited in a different way. The way a house is different when someone is living in it versus when it stands empty. Emmett Crane, who had begun to feel the full weight of his failing eyesight, invited Charles and Matilda to Sunday supper one evening in mid-June, and at that table with the old man's warmth around them and Rosie telling them very precisely about a book she had finished, Charles and Matilda sat close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching and neither of them moved away, and Emmett Crane, who was going blind and knew more than people gave him credit for, smiled into his coffee cup. Walking home that night, Charles and Matilda moved slowly in a way that had nothing to do with their feet being tired. The street was empty and the stars over Kansas were doing their best work, which in June was considerable. "Emmett is going to sell the store," Charles said. "He told me last week." "What will you do?" she asked, and the question had a weight to it that both of them could feel. "I had planned to leave once the business with Goss was resolved," he said. "Go back to Colorado, check on my mother." "And now?" she asked. He stopped walking. She stopped too. They were standing in the middle of the empty street, and the night air was warm and smelled of dust and the distant sweetness of the prairie grass. And Charles Rourke, who was not a man given to impulsive declarations, looked at Matilda Wells with everything he had been collecting in him since April and said, "And now I am less certain about what I want to return to, and more certain about what I do not want to leave." She looked at him. That steady, paying attention look that had been undoing him since April. "Charles," she said quietly, "I am not asking you anything tonight," he said. "There are too many unsettled things, but I wanted you to know where I stand." She nodded slowly. "I know where you stand," she said. "I have known for some time." "And," he asked, "and I am also less certain than I was in April about what I came here for versus what I have found," she said. That was enough. That was, for that night, entirely enough. He walked her to Mrs. Alvarez's boarding house and said good night, and went back to his rented room above the hardware store and lay on his bed staring at the ceiling with the particular feeling of a man who has been carrying a great weight and has been given the first real evidence that he might not have to carry it alone. It was the last peaceful week before everything broke open. The trouble that had been gathering since April arrived suddenly in the last week of June, in the way that trouble in Kansas often arrived, without sufficient warning, and with its full force all at once. The federal land agent, Prescott, sent a letter acknowledging receipt of the complaint regarding the contested property claims. He also, in a piece of bureaucratic misjudgment that would cause a great deal of harm, copied his letter of acknowledgment to the county seat at Caldwell. Goss had a man at the county seat. Within 48 hours, Harlan Goss knew that someone in Caldwell had filed a federal complaint against him. He did not know yet that it was Matilda and Charles working together, but he knew enough to be dangerous, and dangerous he was, immediately and without hesitation. Deputy Percy Fitch came to Charles on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and his face the color of old chalk. "Goss knows about the federal complaint," Percy said. "He has been asking questions. He is furious, Charles. I have not seen him this way before. Who does he think filed it?" "He thinks it was someone from the Hennessy family," Percy said, "but his men are watching the schoolhouse." Charles felt the cold move through him. "Watching the schoolhouse." "I am sorry," Percy said. "I would do more if I had more authority." "I know," Charles said. "It is not your failing." But he went to the schoolhouse immediately, arriving before the children came in for the morning session. Matilda was at her desk, and she looked up when he came through the door, and she read his face before he spoke because she was Matilda Wells and she always read the room. "What happened?" she said. He told her. He watched her absorb it. He watched her go briefly, honestly afraid, and then he watched her put the fear into the particular internal compartment she maintained for things she was afraid of but could not let stop her. "We need to accelerate the matter of your mother's deed," she said. "If Goss is already threatened by the land complaint, we need to move on the deed before he realizes you are also working against him." "If he realizes you are working with me," Charles said, "it becomes significantly more dangerous for you." "It is already dangerous for me," she said. "His men are watching my school." Her voice was level. "I am a woman running a school in a frontier town, and a powerful criminal man has decided I am an inconvenience. Charles, this was never going to be safe. I knew that in April." He looked at her across the classroom with its neat rows of desks, and its map on the wall and its sign that said, "Ask the question you are afraid to ask." That is always the most important one, and he thought that she was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and that he was profoundly afraid of something happening to her, and that the two feelings together were the most clarifying experience of his adult life. "We write to Prescott directly," he said, "by name, with the deed documentation, today." "Today," she agreed, "and we route it through the Wichita Marshal again. And you do not walk anywhere alone until this is resolved." She raised an eyebrow. "Please," he added, and the word came out with more raw honesty than he had intended, and she softened in a way that was not weakness but was its opposite, the kind of openness that requires more courage than protection does. "All right," she said quietly. "Not alone." They sent the letter that day. In it, Charles laid out every piece of evidence he had regarding the fraudulent transfer of his mother's deed, including Tully's sworn statement and the letter from the Colorado County Clerk. Matilda added a legal summary of the grounds for federal review that was so precisely written that Charles read it twice, and then looked at her with open admiration. "You are extraordinary," he said, which was not something he had said to anyone in a very long time, possibly ever. She looked slightly embarrassed, which was the only way she ever looked embarrassed, slightly, fleetingly, before composure reasserted itself. "I grew up reading my father's law books," she said. "He had 3 shelves of them. I read them all twice." "Of course you did," he said, and there was so much warmth in it that she turned back to the letter to give herself somewhere to look. The next 2 weeks were the ones that tested everything. Harlan Goss turned his attention to finding out who was behind the complaints. He was methodical, which was what made him truly frightening. He did not rage and bluster. He moved quietly, gathering information, applying quiet pressure, and the town contracted around him the way a body contracts around a wound. He learned about the routing through Wichita from a man he had bought at the marshal's office there, a small and sorry fact that Percy Fitch confirmed with his eyes downcast. He did not learn who specifically had written the letters, but he had narrowed it down and he was getting closer. On a Wednesday evening in the middle of July, someone threw a rock through the schoolhouse window. The school was empty. The summer break had begun. But Matilda was inside organizing materials for the following term, and the rock missed her by 3 feet and left a pile of broken glass on the floor between the desks. She stood looking at the glass for a moment, and then she swept it up. She did not tell Mrs. Alvarez. She went to find Charles. He was closing up Cranes for the evening, Emmett having already gone to bed. She came through the back door rather than the front, which was the first thing that told him something had happened, because she never used the back door. He turned from the shelf he was tidying and saw her face, and was across the room in 3 strides. "Are you hurt?" he said, both hands on her shoulders, and the physical fact of his hands on her was so immediate and grounding that she felt the shaking she had been suppressing come up and then subside again. "I'm not hurt," she said. "Someone threw a rock through the schoolhouse window." His jaw set. His eyes went very still. "Were you inside?" "Yes, it missed me." "Matilda," he said, and his voice was low and fierce with a feeling he was making no attempt to conceal. "I am all right," she said. "You were nearly hit with a rock in the building where you work," he said, "and Harlan Goss's men are watching you, and this is not something I am able to be calm about." "I know," she said softly. He was still holding her shoulders. They were standing very close in the dim back room of Crane's Dry Goods with the evening coming through the small window behind him, and he realized suddenly that his hands were on her and that he had not asked, and that he had done it as naturally as breathing, and he started to move them away. "Don't," she said quietly, just that one word. He went still. She looked up at him, and the distance between them was nothing, and she said, "I am also not calm about this, for the record." He kissed her. It was nothing like the careless, impulsive kind of first kiss. It was deliberate and careful and full of everything that had been accumulating since April, since chalk and primers and the quality of afternoon light, and she kissed him back with exactly the same quality of full attention that she brought to everything she did, and when they separated they were both breathing differently than before. "Well," she said after a moment. "Yes," he said, which was not much of a sentence but was the most honest thing he could produce right then. She leaned her forehead briefly against his collarbone, and he put one hand up to the back of her head, carefully, as though she were something he had been afraid of holding too tightly, and they stood that way for a moment in the quiet of Emmett Crane's back room while the summer dark came down over Caldwell, Kansas. "We are going to resolve this," she said into the fabric of his shirt. "Yes," he said again, differently this time. The reply from Federal Agent Prescott came 10 days later, on a Saturday morning, and it was everything they had hoped for, and also came with a piece of information that changed the immediate calculus entirely. Prescott was sending a federal investigator to Caldwell. The investigator would arrive within the week. In the meantime, Prescott strongly advised the complainants not to take any direct action, as it could compromise the investigation. It was good news. It was the right result of 2 months of careful, patient work. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it created a window of danger, a week of knowing that help was coming while the man who wanted to prevent it was still fully operational in Caldwell, and increasingly aware that something was working against him. It was in that window that Harlan Goss made his move against Charles. How he connected Charles to the complaints was a matter Charles would piece together later. The man at the marshal's office in Wichita had recognized the hand that addressed the letters, which was Charles's, because Charles had done business with that office in his own name when he had first arrived in Caldwell and registered at Emmett Crane's store. The handwriting matched. And when Goss began asking about Charles Rourke with the particular focused attention he applied to problems he intended to solve, one of the older cowboys at the Silver Spur, a man who had been in Dodge City in 1879, recognized the name from the night of the robbery, from the night Cole Goss had died. It was enough. It was more than enough for a man like Harlan Goss. He sent 3 of his men to pick Charles up on a Thursday evening, which they did efficiently and without unnecessary drama, simply surrounding him as he walked back from the post office and suggesting, with the weight of the revolvers on their hips making the suggestion rather clearly, that he accompany them to the Silver Spur for a conversation with Mr. Goss. Charles went because resisting 3 armed men on the main street of Caldwell at 7 in the evening was not a plan. It was a funeral arrangement. He went, and he calculated as he walked, and what he calculated was not hopeful in the immediate term. At the Silver Spur, Harlan Goss was waiting at a corner table with a glass of whiskey and a pistol on the table beside it. He had Charles kneel on the floor, which was a dominance exercise that Charles submitted to not because he was afraid but because he was thinking about how to get out of this room alive, and kneeling was not a death sentence while arguing about kneeling could become one very fast. "You were in Dodge City in '79, Goss said, when Cole died." "I was," Charles said. "No point in denying it. You were riding with him. Briefly. I was 28 and I made a serious error in judgment. Your brother was killed in that robbery. I had no part in the robbery itself and I watched him die, and it has been on my conscience every day since. And you have come to Caldwell," Goss said, "and filed federal complaints against me. I came to Caldwell to reclaim my mother's property, which you stole through a fraudulent deed transfer in 1880. Whatever federal interest has been generated is a consequence of you operating a land fraud enterprise that affects 20 families in this county, not just mine." Goss picked up the pistol. "I admire directness," he said. "I do not particularly admire it at this moment, but on principle." The gun went to Charles's temple. The 3 men arranged themselves around the room. The saloon had emptied, the bartender having found a reason to be in the back suddenly, the other patrons having made equally speedy discoveries of things to do elsewhere. The clock on the wall said 8:47, and at 9 o'clock the door opened and Matilda Wells walked in. She had the note in her hand, the one that had been slipped under the schoolhouse door. She had ridden 11 miles of it from Mrs. Alvarez's where she had been when it was delivered, not 11 miles but 11 blocks and one terrible stretch of time where her entire body was trying to think faster than fear would let it. She stood in the doorway. She saw Charles on his knees. She saw the gun. She saw Harlan Goss. She did not scream. She did not run. She walked forward into the room with the kind of deliberate calm that is not the absence of fear but its complete, total overriding by something more important, and she stood 3 feet from Harlan Goss's table and she said, "Mr. Goss, whatever you are intending to do tonight will significantly complicate the federal investigation that has been opened into your affairs." Goss looked at her with genuine surprise. He had not expected this. "Miss Wells," he said, "a federal investigator named Prescott arrives in Caldwell within the week," she said. "He is coming from Topeka with documentation for a formal review of your land activities in this county. He knows this address. He knows your name. He knows the names of every family whose property claims you have manipulated." She paused. "Killing Mr. Rourke tonight would be adding a capital crime to an existing federal fraud case. That is not a transaction that benefits you." The gun was still at Charles's temple. Goss was looking at Matilda with the flat, clever eyes calculating. "You are bluffing," he said. "I am a school teacher," she said. "I teach children the value of precision and honesty. I am not bluffing." Charles, on his knees with a gun at his head, was looking at Matilda with an expression that would later, much later, make her put her face in her hands when he described it back to her, because it was the expression of a man completely and utterly overcome. He kept it very controlled, but it was there. Goss set the pistol down on the table. He looked at Matilda for a long moment and then he said very quietly, "You are a formidable woman, Miss Wells." "Thank you," she said evenly. "I suggest you let Mr. Rourke stand up." And Harlan Goss, who had never in his 45 years let a woman tell him what to do, made a calculation that was purely self-interested and nodded to his men. Charles stood. He walked to Matilda's side. His hand found hers in the gap between their bodies where no one else could see, and he held it, and she held it back. They walked out of the Silver Spur together into the night air of Caldwell, Kansas, and they did not stop walking until they were 2 blocks away and around a corner and out of the sight line of any of Goss's men. And then Charles stopped and turned to her, and she turned to him, and for a moment they simply stood and breathed. "The federal investigator," he said. "He really is coming." "He really is," she said. "I received the letter this morning. I was going to tell you this evening when I found your note was not there and another note was." She held up the one that had been slipped under the door. "Someone warned us." "Percy," Charles said immediately. "That was my assumption also." He took her face in both his hands, and she felt the slight trembling in them that he was controlling, and she covered his hands with hers. "You walked into that room," he said. "Yes. You walked in there for me." "Charles," she said, "you could have been hurt. You could have been killed. Matilda, you walked into that room with nothing but the truth and your own nerve." "It was enough," she said. "This time," he said, his voice rough with something that was not anger but shared its intensity. "This time was what we had," she said simply, and he pulled her into his arms and held her with both arms fully around her, and she pressed her face against the side of his neck and felt the pulse there, fast and alive and real. And the relief was so enormous that it came out of her as a long, slow exhale that seemed to take half of July with it. The federal investigator arrived 4 days later, on a Monday, and his name was not Prescott, but rather a man named Harker who worked under Prescott's direction, and who had the efficient, particular energy of someone who enjoyed doing his job well. He was in his late 30s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a leather satchel that he guarded as though it contained the Book of Revelation, which in a practical sense it did, for Caldwell at least. He met with Charles and Matilda together on Monday afternoon in the back of Crane's, because it was the most private space available, and because Emmett Crane, who had been told only that it was a business matter of some importance, served them coffee and pie and asked no questions, which was his particular form of grace. Harker reviewed the documentation that Charles and Matilda had assembled with the focused silence of a man who was either impressed or showing no reaction at all, and it was difficult to tell which until he set down the last page and said, "This is an exceptionally well-organized case. Whoever drafted the legal summary understood the relevant statutes very precisely." "Miss Wells," Charles said. Harker looked at Matilda over his spectacles. "You are the school teacher." "I am," she said. "Your father was a lawyer, a school teacher. He had 3 shelves of law books." "He clearly read them thoroughly," Harker said, which was the closest he came to a compliment and which Matilda received with a small, contained smile. Harker moved quickly. Harlan Goss was formally served with papers on Tuesday morning, which was done with the assistance of Deputy Percy Fitch who, freed from the paralysis of being the only legal authority in a town where the criminal element significantly outweighed him, moved with a purpose and straightness that Charles had not seen in him before, and which made him think Percy Fitch would be all right once this was resolved. Goss did not go quietly, because men like Harlan Goss never went quietly. He attempted to leave Caldwell on Tuesday afternoon with 2 of his men, and was intercepted by Harker and 2 federal deputies who had arrived quietly on the noon train. There was a brief and ugly confrontation at the east edge of town that resulted in one of Goss's men suffering a broken wrist, and all 3 of them being taken into federal custody without further incident. Goss was silent during the arrest, which was somehow worse than rage, but it was the silence of a finished thing, and Charles, watching from the boardwalk with Matilda beside him, recognized it for what it was. The matter of his mother's deed was resolved within 10 days of Goss's arrest. The fraudulent transfer was reversed by the Federal Land Office, and the title to Ada Rourke's Colorado property was restored to her name. Charles wrote his mother a letter on the day the paperwork was confirmed, a long letter that was also an apology for 3 years of worrying her, and when the reply came 3 weeks later, it was in Ada Rourke's large, clear handwriting, and it said, among other things, that she was glad her son had found a good person to stand beside him, and that she would very much like to meet this schoolteacher he had apparently forgotten to mention until now. The Hennessy family and the other affected Caldwell families had their property claims restored over the following months, a process that required more correspondence and patience, but which moved steadily forward under Harker's supervision, and with Matilda's continued assistance in the documentation. The summer break ended, and September came with its first sharp edge of autumn, and Matilda's school opened for its new term with 13 students now, one addition being the young son of a family that had come to Caldwell in August following a drought that had taken their Oklahoma homestead. His name was Thomas. He was 7 years old, and he had the same quality of quiet intensity that Matilda recognized and knew how to work with. She and Charles had continued and deepened what had begun in April with the slow, serious accumulation of two people who take each other genuinely and do not want to get it wrong. They had evenings together at Emmett's table and walks along the edge of town in the cooling September air. They had conversations that lasted hours and felt like minutes. They had the quiet, domestic habits of two people settling into each other's company. The way Charles always had a candle lit when she came to Crane's in the early evening. The way she saved newspaper articles that she thought would interest him and left them on the counter with no explanation. The way they could sit in comfortable, productive silence for 20 minutes and then pick up a conversation exactly where they had left it. One evening in late September, sitting on the steps of the feed store that had been vacant since June and now had a for sale sign in its window, Charles said something that he had been building toward for weeks without knowing it was coming. The evening was quiet. The main street was empty except for a cat crossing from one boardwalk to the other with the unhurried dignity of a creature that had no concerns. The sky over Kansas was the particular deep blue of a clear autumn evening just before the first stars come out. "You have the quietest way of making a place feel whole," he said. He said it the way people say the most important things, without preamble and without ceremony, because the important things come out when they are ready and not a moment before. He said it looking at the empty street, and then he looked at her. She looked back at him. Something moved across her face that was too large and too real for any of the usual responses, too true for the deflecting wit that was sometimes her first defense, too immediate for the composed steadiness that was her second. He had reached past all of it and said something that was so precisely accurate, that named something she had been doing and had not known she was doing, that she had no answer for it. She had no answer for it for a long time. He watched her not answer. He did not rush her. The first star appeared over the edge of the hardware store roof to the east. Finally she said, "I did not know anyone noticed." "I have noticed everything," he said quietly, "since April. Every single thing." She turned fully toward him on the steps and looked at him, really looked at him, with all of the attention she had, every bit of it, and what she saw was a man who had made a serious mistake once and had been making amends for it ever since, who had come to a frontier town with a secret purpose and had found something he had not planned for, who was careful and honest and brave in the quiet, unglamorous way that was the hardest kind of brave to be, who had beautiful eyes and rough hands, and who had ordered a McGuffey primer and set aside good ink because she had mentioned needing them in passing. "I love you," she said, just that. Not as a return volley, but as its own complete sentence, its own finished thing. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been in love with you since the night I told you the full truth about my history, and you said that the generous reading was also the accurate one, and then started drafting a plan," he said. "I did not say it then because the circumstances were poor." "They are better now," she said. "They are considerably better," he agreed, and took her hand, and they sat together on the steps of the empty feed store in the deepening September evening, and the cat crossed back the other direction, and the stars came out over Kansas in their full autumn abundance, and it was, Matilda would think later, the most complete and perfect ordinary evening she had ever experienced. Emmett Crane sold the dry goods store in October to a young man from Abilene named Garrett who had arrived with his wife, and an ambition that Caldwell had room for. Emmett kept the house and Rosie, and was well. Charles negotiated a position with Garrett to stay on through the winter as a manager, which gave him time to consider what came next. What came next arrived in the form of a letter from Ada Rourke in November, written in her large, clear hand, asking whether her son had any plans for the Colorado property now that it was restored. Because if he was thinking of working the land again, she had seeds put by, and a list of repairs the fencing needed, and she was 63 years old, and not getting any younger, and she would very much appreciate knowing what the plan was, if he had one. Charles read this letter at Matilda's boarding house on a Sunday afternoon while she sat across from him grading papers. He read it twice and then he looked up. "I think," he said carefully, "that I should ask you something, and I want to be clear that there is no pressure and that whatever your answer is, it will be respected entirely." She set down her pen. She gave him her full attention, which was a serious and considerable thing to receive. "My mother's property in Colorado is 20 acres with a house and a barn," he said. "The house needs work. The land needs work. It is not Caldwell and it is not St. Louis, and it is in the frontier territory, and it would be a significant undertaking for anyone who came there with me." He paused. "I am asking if you would come there with me. Not immediately. Not until the school year ends and a replacement can be found. But in June, if that is what you chose, I would like you to come to Colorado as my wife, if you would be willing to be my wife." She was quiet. He waited through the quiet with the patience he had learned in this particular relationship, which was its own education. "Your mother would be there," she said finally. "In the short term, yes, until we were established and she was satisfied that the fencing was adequately repaired." Matilda's expression, which had been carefully neutral during the question, now broke open into something warm and real and slightly amused. "She sounds formidable," she said. "She is," Charles said. "You will like each other enormously and immediately. I am certain of it." "Are you proposing to me by describing the state of your fencing?" she said. "I am proposing to you by being honest about the conditions," he said, "because you are a person who would rather have the honest conditions than a flattering version, and because I have known you long enough to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes to the conditions," he said, "or yes to the question." "Yes to you," she said. "All of it. The fence and your mother in Colorado and all of it." He came around the table and took her hands, and she stood, and they held each other in the afternoon light of Mrs. Alvarez's parlor, with the papers spread across the table and the Kansas afternoon going golden outside the window. And this was, for both of them, the particular kind of happiness that does not require any grandeur to be entirely real. They were married in Caldwell in December of 1882. On a Saturday that was cold and bright and blowing, with the clean prairie wind that smelled of snow coming. The ceremony was in the small Methodist church on the east side of town, performed by Reverend Coles, who had lived in Caldwell for 12 years and had seen enough of its history to know when something genuinely good was happening. Emmett Crane sat in the front pew with Rosie beside him. Percy Fitch was there in his deputy's uniform, standing straighter than usual. Several of Matilda's students came with their parents, Thomas and the Donahue twins, and a handful of others who had acquired an investment in their teacher's happiness over the months of the school year. The church was not large, and it was not ornate. It had wooden pews and plain glass windows, and a wood stove that was working hard against the December cold. Matilda wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks prior, a deep blue wool with white collar, simple and well cut and entirely her. She carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers that Rosie had put together with the serious artistic attention she brought to anything she made. Charles stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that was the best piece of clothing he had ever owned, which Emmett had quietly arranged to have tailored in Wichita as a wedding gift, And when Matilda walked in, he forgot momentarily what words were for, which was becoming something of a pattern when it came to her. They exchanged their vows with the directness that characterized everything they did together. When it was done and Reverend Coles pronounced them married, Charles kissed his wife with a reverence and a fullness that made Emmett Crane clear his throat loudly, and Rosie smile her quiet smile, and Percy Fitch look at the ceiling with great interest. The celebration after was at Emmett's house, which was warm and full and smelled of the food that half the congregation had contributed, and there was music from a fiddle player named Stokes, who was the best musician in Caldwell and who played until midnight without stopping, except to accept a glass of the good whiskey someone had brought out for the occasion. Matilda danced with Charles twice and with Emmett once and with Percy Fitch, who was a better dancer than anyone had expected, and she stood at the edge of the room at one point with a glass of cider in her hand, watching Charles talking to Emmett, watching the way he bent slightly to hear the old man over the music, the particular quality of his attention and his patience, and she thought, there it is. There is the whole of it. This is what I came west for. They did not leave for Colorado until June, as planned. Matilda finished the school year and recommended a replacement teacher to the school board, a young woman from Wichita named Clara Bright, who was 23 years old and capable, and whom Matilda spent 2 full Saturdays with, going over the students and their particular needs and strengths, and particularly Rosie, who would be starting her last year with this school before moving on to the secondary school in Wichita, and who needed a teacher who understood that a quiet child was not a diminished one. The winter and spring in Caldwell were a season of ordinary happiness, which is the best kind, characterized by mornings and evenings and shared meals, and the small, specific textures of 2 people building a life in the same direction. Charles worked at Garrett's store through March, and then helped a local rancher named Dean with his spring calving in April and May, work that was hard and physical, and which he was good at, and which paid enough to add to the savings they were accumulating for the move. Matilda read her father's law books in the evenings, which she had brought in her 2 trunks from St. Louis and which took up an entire shelf in the small house they had rented from a widow named Mrs. Tomlin for the winter months. She read them not because she had plans exactly, but because knowledge was the inheritance worth keeping, and because she suspected that in Colorado, as in Caldwell, there would be people who needed someone who could read a legal document and explain it plainly. She was also, by March, quietly certain that she was expecting a child. She told Charles on a Sunday morning in the kitchen of Mrs. Tomlin's house, over coffee, simply and directly. He sat very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression so full that she almost had to look away from it. And then he got up and came around the table and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling very well," she said. "I have been throwing up every morning for 2 weeks, but otherwise very well." He laughed, and it was the full, genuine laugh that was rarer than gold and worth exactly as much, and she thought, there it is again. They told Ada Rourke in the same letter in which they confirmed their arrival date in June. Ada's reply arrived in May and ran to 4 pages of densely written commentary, which included practical advice about the first trimester, strong opinions about the quality of the doctoring in the nearest Colorado town, a list of things she was preparing for the arrival of her daughter-in-law, a separate list of things that needed doing to the house before a baby arrived, and at the very end, in a slightly different ink as though she had added it after setting the letter down and picking it up again. "I have been waiting 20 years for Charles to find someone worthy of him. I am glad the wait is over. You sound exactly right." Matilda read this last line 4 times. They loaded their belongings onto a wagon on the first Saturday of June, 1883. Emmett Crane came to see them off with Rosie at his side, the 2 of them standing in the early morning light of the Caldwell Main Street, where the whole story had begun in April of the previous year. Percy Fitch came. Several of the students came with their parents. Thomas, who was 8 now and had grown a full inch since September, presented Matilda with a drawing he had made of the schoolhouse, detailed and careful and clearly executed with the seriousness he brought to everything. "I am going to be a cartographer," Thomas told her, holding out the drawing. "When I grow up." "I believe you completely," she said, and took the drawing and folded it and put it inside her coat against her heart, which was not a thing she planned but was the right thing to do. She hugged Emmett, who was stiffer in his movements than he had been in April of last year, but whose eyes, even failing as they were, found her face and held it with all the warmth of a man who had watched something good happen and was glad to have seen it. "You will write," he said. It was not a question. "Off," she said. "And you will write back." "Rosie will write back," he said. "She is better at it than I am." Rosie, standing at his elbow, looked at Matilda with those deep, inhabited quiet eyes and said, "I will write every week." "So will I," Matilda said, and meant it. Charles shook hands with Percy and with Emmett and crouched down to say something to Rosie that Matilda did not hear, which made Rosie smile the particular smile she reserved for things she found genuinely funny, which was rare and therefore precious. Then he climbed up onto the wagon seat and reached down his hand, and Matilda took it, and he pulled her up beside him, and Caldwell was arranged before them in the morning light. The main street and the schoolhouse and the empty feed store steps and Crane's Dry Goods with its new sign and the Silver Spur Saloon and all of it, the whole year of it, present in the familiar shapes of buildings and the faces of the people standing in the road to watch them go. "Ready?" Charles said. "Yes," she said. And they went. The Colorado property was everything Charles had described and somewhat more of everything, because a winter and half a spring without attention had given the weeds and the fence and the roof additional arguments for needing work. The house was a solid, square-built structure with good bones and immediate needs, and the barn was in better shape than the house, which was the wrong order of things but workable. The 20 acres rolled out toward the mountains in the particular way of Colorado land, not flat like Kansas but folded and varied, with a creek at the southern edge that ran clear and cold even in June, and aspens along its bank that were going to be extraordinary in October. Ada Rourke was waiting on the porch when they pulled up, and she was exactly as formidable as Charles had predicted, a straight-backed woman of 63 with white hair and dark eyes, and the look of someone who had built something under difficult circumstances and knew exactly what they had done. She looked at Matilda the way someone looks at a person they have already decided about and are simply confirming. "You are exactly as described," Ada said, which covered a great deal of ground very efficiently. "So are you," Matilda said, which was the right answer, and Ada smiled, which transformed her face entirely. The summer was work. It was the specific, physical, daily work of a homestead in the mountain west. Fence posts and roof shingles and garden beds, and the particular diplomacy of 3 adults in one house who all had opinions about how things should be done. Ada and Matilda came to an efficient, genuine understanding within the first week, the kind built on mutual respect and the recognition of competence, and Charles watched the 2 most formidable women he had ever met become allies with a relief that went bone deep. He fixed the fence. He rebuilt the north wall of the barn. He cleared the creek bank of the deadfall that had accumulated over 2 winters, and repaired the small irrigation channel that ran from the creek to the kitchen garden. He worked with his hands from dawn to the middle of the afternoon every day, and in the evenings he sat with Matilda on the porch in the cooling mountain air while Ada read inside, and they talked or were quiet, and both were good. The nearest town was a place called Harrow, 8 miles to the east, population 400, with a doctor named Ames who was competent and a land office that was considerably better managed than the one in Caldwell, and a school that was short 1 teacher following the departure of its last one in May for reasons that became clear when Matilda walked in, saw the state of the classroom, and noted that whoever had been teaching here had done so with minimal engagement and a great deal of noise. She did not intend to take the position. She had a child coming in the fall and a homestead to help establish, and Ada's company and the fence and the garden. She did not intend to. By August, she was teaching. It was 4 days a week to start, shortened hours to accommodate the pregnancy and the distance, and Charles drove her in and back in the wagon with the efficiency of a man who had fully accepted that his wife was going to teach school, and that this was simply part of the landscape of their life together, and a very fine part at that. Their son was born on the 3rd of October, 1883, in the house on the Colorado property, with Dr. Ames present and Ada managing the room with the brisk competence of a woman who had seen a great deal and was not easily alarmed. Charles was not in the room for the birth because that was not how it was done, and he sat on the porch in the October air listening to the aspens, which were at their full gold October intensity, exactly as extraordinary as he had anticipated. And when Ada came to the door and said, "Come in, Charles, come meet your son," he went in with his heart in his throat and his hands not quite steady. His son was red-faced and decisive in his opinions, which he expressed at volume. Matilda was exhausted and radiant in the way of new mothers who have done something enormous and know it, propped against the pillow with the child against her chest, and her eyes full of a feeling that did not have a single name, being composed of too many things for one word to hold. Charles sat on the edge of the bed and she placed the child in his arms, and he held his son for the first time with the same careful, full attention he had brought to everything that mattered to him, and the baby looked up at him with the dark, unfocused eyes of the newborn, and Charles said nothing for a long moment and then said to Matilda, "He is the most important thing I have ever seen." "Yes," she said. "He is." They named him James for Matilda's father, James Wells Rourke, carrying both inheritances forward. Ada held James that evening with the expression of a woman who has arrived at the end of a very long road and finds the destination exactly what she needed it to be. She said nothing sentimental because she was not a sentimental woman, but she held that baby with a tenderness that said everything the words did not, and when she finally handed him back to Matilda she said only, "He has Charles's hands already," which was true, and which meant something to all of them. The years that followed were the years of the homestead, the work and the seasons and the accumulation of ordinary days that turn out, in the reckoning, to have been extraordinary all along. The fence held. The garden produced. The house was expanded in the spring of 1885 to add a room when it became clear that James was going to need a sibling, and that Matilda Wells Rourke was a woman who did not do things by halves. Their second child was a girl, born in July of 1885, whom they named Ada for her grandmother, which made the elder Ada first deny that she was moved by this, and then go out to the garden for 20 minutes where no one could see her face. Young Ada arrived into the world with the same decisive opinions as her brother and considerably more hair, and by the time she was 2 years old she was already showing signs of the particular quality of attention that ran in her mother's line, the kind that paid notice to everything and forgot nothing. James, at 3, had Charles's seriousness and Matilda's curiosity, an excellent combination that would serve him well throughout his life. He was already fascinated by the horses and by the mountains, and by the books on the shelf that he could not yet read, but could spend extraordinary stretches of time examining. Emmett Crane had passed away in the winter of 1884, peacefully and in his sleep, which was the best end a person could hope for. Rosie had gone to the secondary school in Wichita as planned and was, by every account in the letters she wrote, exactly as remarkable as Matilda had always known she was. She was studying to be a teacher herself. She wrote once a month, reliable as the mail service allowed, long letters full of the sharp, precise observations of a person who had learned to trust what she saw. Percy Fitch was the marshal of Caldwell now, Harlan Goss's arrest, and the subsequent restoration of order having created a vacancy in the moral authority of the town that Percy had stepped into with a competence that surprised no one who had actually been paying attention. In the spring of 1886, a letter came from Topeka confirming the final settlement of the federal case against Harlan Goss and several of his associates. The letter was addressed to both Charles Rourke and Matilda Wells, which Harker, the federal investigator, had apparently insisted upon, noting in his accompanying note that the case had been built on the documentary work of both complainants equally and that the record should reflect this. Matilda kept this letter. She kept it in the same place she kept Thomas's drawing of the schoolhouse, among the things that she would not lose. Goss himself had been tried in a federal court in Topeka and sentenced to 12 years, a verdict that Charles received with the particular quiet of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and has finally set it down. He went out to the fence line alone that evening and stood there for a while in the Colorado dusk, and when he came back his face was different, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the failing light and everything to do with the thing he had put down. Ada Rourke, the elder, lived on the homestead until the autumn of 1887, when she decided, at 68 years old, that she had earned the right to go live in Denver with her niece's family, which was somewhat warmer than the mountain property in winter, and somewhat closer to the particular kind of dry goods store that sold the fabric she liked. She packed her things with the efficiency of a woman who had moved before and knew what mattered, and she said goodbye to Charles with a long look that communicated volumes in the compressed language they had always spoken, and she held Matilda's face in both hands and said, "You are the best thing that has ever happened to my son, and that is not a small statement." "You have set an extremely high bar," Matilda said. "You have cleared it consistently," Ada said. "I am deeply satisfied." And she got into the wagon and did not look back, which was also entirely her way. Matilda watched the wagon go down the property lane toward the Harrow Road and then turned back to the house, where James was chasing young Ada around the porch with a stick horse, and the October aspens were doing their gold work over the creek, and Charles was standing in the barn doorway watching her watch all of it. She walked to him. He met her partway. They stood in the yard of their homestead in the autumn mountain light with their children making noise on the porch and the mountains arranged to the west in their enormous permanence. And she thought about the schoolhouse in Caldwell with its sign about asking the important questions, and the night in the Silver Spur when she had walked in with nothing but the truth and her own nerve, and the steps of the empty feed store and the first stars over Kansas, and a note that said, "Ask the question you are afraid to ask. That is always the most important one." "What are you thinking?" Charles said. She looked at him. "I am thinking that I have no complaints," she said. "That is a significant statement from you," he said. "I have a great many opinions," she said. "Complaints are a separate category." He laughed, the full genuine laugh, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the children on the porch redirected their noise toward them in the way of small children who have excellent radar for parental inattention, and the afternoon held all of them in its autumn light. In the school at Harrow, in the classroom that Matilda had rearranged within the first week of teaching there, on the wall beside the window where the light came in from the left, there was a sign in her handwriting, "Ask the question you are afraid to ask." That is always the most important one. The children who had read it over the years had asked many things, hard questions about the war, about why some people were treated differently than others, about what happened after you died, about why the mountains were that color at evening. Matilda had answered as honestly as she could and deferred with equal honesty what she could not answer, and the classroom was, as a result, a place where people thought, which is the thing she had always wanted a classroom to be. She turned 40 in 1896, and Charles threw a party for her, which was entirely characteristic of him in that it was not a large party but a precisely right one. Rosie, who had come back to Colorado to teach in a school 2 towns over and had become Matilda's closest friend. Percy Fitch, who came from Caldwell on the stage with his new wife, a sensible woman named Bet who had been a telegraph operator, Dr. Ames and his wife. 3 of Matilda's Harrow students who were now adults and who came because they wanted to. James, at 13, was taller than Charles had been at that age, with his mother's eyes and a seriousness that was all his own. He had been asking recently about the law, about what it meant for property and for rights, and for the people who did not have either enforced properly. And Matilda had taken him through her father's law books one by one, and watched his expression as he worked through the language and the logic. And she felt the particular pleasure of a teacher recognizing a student who will go further than she has gone. Young Ada, at 11, was already the best rider on the homestead, which she took as a matter of fact and not a particular distinction. And she had opinions about everything and expressed them completely, which was either delightful or challenging depending on the day and the opinion. She had her grandmother Ada's eyes and her mother's attention, and a stubbornness that appeared to be entirely original. Charles managed the property with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to read land and animals and seasons, and who found a deep satisfaction in the work that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with the particular rightness of a life built with care, and kept that way. He was 45 now, his dark hair threaded with gray, his face more lined than it had been in 1882 and more settled. The scar on his right hand was still there. He had told James the truth about how he came to be in Caldwell, about Cole Goss and the robbery, when James was 12 and asked directly. He had told it without elision or flattery, and James had listened with his mother's quality of attention, and when it was done had said, "You fixed it." "I tried to," Charles said. "You went to Caldwell and spent a year in danger and helped all those families, and grandmother got her land back and you met Mother," James said. "That is fixing it." Charles had sat quietly with this for a moment and then said, "Your mother helped considerably." "She usually does," James said, with the particular affection of a child who has watched his parents for 13 years and knows exactly what he is looking at. The homestead in Colorado was a complete and living thing by the turn of the century, 20 acres of worked and tended land, with a house that had been expanded twice, and a barn that had been rebuilt once, and a kitchen garden that produced more than they needed, and a fence that Charles maintained with the ongoing attention of a man who had once let it go and knew the cost. The creek still ran clear at the southern edge. The aspens were still extraordinary in October. In the evenings, when the children were older and had their own evenings to attend to, Matilda and Charles sat on the porch in the particular quiet of a shared life that has found its shape and settled into it. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they were simply there together, watching the stars come out over the mountains, which did this gradually, and then all at once in the way that important things sometimes do. Matilda had published, in 1898, a small handbook for frontier schoolteachers that addressed practical methods for teaching in under-resourced classrooms, managing mixed-age groups, and building school cultures that supported the particular emotional needs of children living in the challenges of frontier life. She had written it over 2 years in the early mornings before the household woke, in the kitchen with a lamp and coffee, and the Colorado dark outside the window. The publisher was a small educational press in Kansas City, and the handbook had sold steadily enough that a second printing was ordered. She received letters from teachers in Montana and Arizona and New Mexico who had read it, and she answered everyone. Charles read it when she handed it to him, cover to cover, and when he was done, he set it on the table and looked at her across the kitchen and said, "Your father's law books were 3 shelves long, and you read them twice, and you read everything else you could find, and you took it all and distilled it into 42 pages that anyone teaching in a difficult situation can use immediately." He paused. "Matilda, your father would have been so proud." She held herself very steady, the way she always did when something went straight to the deep place. "I hope so," she said. "I am certain," he said. The new century arrived, and with it the particular sense that the West they had known, the frontier west of cattle drives and territorial marshals and men like Harlan Goss operating in the spaces between laws, was becoming something different, more organized and less wild, which was in most ways a good thing and in a few ways a loss, the way all endings are. James Wells Rourke went to the University of Colorado in 1901 to study law, carrying both inheritances forward as his name suggested he might. He was a serious, precise young man who had his mother's way with an argument and his father's way with silence, and both would serve him. Ada Rourke the younger went in 1903, not to university, which she might have done, but to Wyoming to work with the women's suffrage movement that was already established there, which was exactly what anyone who had known Ada from the age of 3 would have predicted, and which made her mother deeply proud and her father simultaneously proud and slightly anxious, which was his general condition regarding Ada. The homestead went on, the fence and the garden and the creek and the aspens. Rosie and Matilda exchanged letters every week without exception for 20 years, and when Rosie finally came to teach in Harrow in 1904, taking over the school when Matilda felt the time had come to let someone younger have the classroom, it felt like a completion of something that had begun with a book placed on a quiet girl's desk in Caldwell, Kansas, in April of 1882. Charles and Matilda were in their late 40s now, and the homestead ran with the efficiency of long familiarity, and they were, in the careful accounting of the life they had built, exactly where they had needed to be. Not because it had been easy. It had not been easy. There had been the years when money was short and the work was hard and exhaustion made everything more difficult. There had been the winter of 1893 when Charles had a fever for 3 weeks that genuinely frightened her. There had been the year the creek ran low in a drought and they lost most of the garden. There had been the arguments, the real ones, the kind that happen between two people who both have strong convictions and a tendency toward directness, and who have to find their way back to each other through the specific work of choosing to. They always found their way back. They found their way back because they had chosen each other not in the careless, impulsive way of people who are swept along by circumstances, but in the deliberate and fully informed way of two people who knew who they were and had looked at each other clearly in the light of that knowledge and said, "Yes, this one." On an evening in June of 1907, Matilda came out of the house to find Charles sitting on the porch steps where they had always sat, the same posture he had held on the feed store steps in Caldwell 25 years ago, elbows on his knees and hands loose and eyes on the middle distance. She sat beside him. The evening light was doing its mountain work, the particular gold and rose that Colorado evenings did that Kansas could not quite match, though she had loved Kansas too. "James wrote," she said. "He has been made a junior partner." "I know," Charles said. "I got a letter also. Ada is giving a speech in Cheyenne next month." "I know that too." He was smiling. They sat. The aspens along the creek were in their summer green. The mountains were vast and purple and permanent. "You have the quietest way of making a place feel whole," Charles said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with all of it in his face, everything the years had added, the work and the children and the grief and the happiness and the mornings and evenings and all the ordinary days, and she had no answer for it. She never had an answer for it. What she had was her hand finding his on the porch step between them, and his fingers closing around hers with the familiar ease of 25 years, and the evening coming down over the Colorado mountains in its gold and rose, while the aspens stirred along the creek, and the whole homestead, breathed in and out in the way of a living thing that is well and whole and where it should be. That was enough. That was, in the full accounting of everything, entirely more than enough. The story of Matilda Wells and Charles Rourke was not a dramatic one in the way that stories in the papers were dramatic, not a story about gunfights and bank robberies, and the glamour of the West that dime novels had built into something it mostly was not. It was quieter than that, and more real than that. It was the story of a woman who went west with 2 trunks and an inheritance of knowledge and a compass that pointed away from the safe path, and a man who came to a frontier town carrying guilt and love for his mother and more courage than he knew what to do with, and the particular thing that happened when two people who paid attention to each other. It was a story about what gets built when people choose, again and again, to build rather than to take, to stay rather than to flee, to be honest rather than comfortable. It was the story of a note slipped under a schoolhouse door, and a woman riding through a Kansas dust storm with her hands cut from the reins. It was the story of a blue primer and good ink, and the question you are afraid to ask, and the light in the afternoon, and the quality of silence, and what it means to make a place feel whole. It was, in the end, exactly the story that both of them had been living toward without knowing it, across all the distance and the decisions and the years, until they found each other in a frontier town in the spring of 1882 and recognized, slowly and then all at once, that this was the place, and this was the person, and this was it. The aspens turned gold in October. The fence held. The creek ran clear. And Matilda Wells Rourke, sitting on the porch steps with her husband's hand in hers as the sun went down over the Colorado mountains, had no answer for what he had said, and did not need one. The life they had built together was the answer, every ordinary, extraordinary day of it.